to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and today I'm really happy to welcome onto the show Larry Rasmussen. Larry, thanks for making time for us.
My pleasure.
So for folks who aren't familiar with you and your work, you're the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics Emeritus at Union Theological Seminary and author of several works related to earth, environment, ethics, theology, including Earth Community, Earth Ethics, a wonderful book. You're a recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society of Christian Ethics, and you've mentored a generation of scholars in eco-theology and green religion, rooted in practices of environmental justice within community contexts. So really happy to talk to you, and especially about your newest book, The Planet You Inherit, Letters to My Grandchildren When Uncertainty is a Sure Thing. Really wonderful book. So before we get into that, I want to just talk a little bit about how you got into this work. I'm always so curious to hear how people come to a point where theology and environment somehow combine. Because of course, for some people, those seem completely opposed. You know, you're either going to study the environment down here or you'll study God up there. And, you know, those are often the spiritual and the material realms don't intersect for everybody so clearly. So I'm curious, how did you get into this kind of stuff?
Well, I can date that from Earth Day because I was around for participation in that first Earth Day. And I was also around when OPEC was founded, and during the Carter administration, there was a so-called energy crisis, long lines at the gas station. I was just beginning seminary teaching at that time, and I thought to myself, I need to do something on energy and ethics. So that's when it started, which would have been early 70s. And I've been doing it off and on since then. But as I look back farther, it really began in grad school. I was at Union as a PhD student in the mid-60s. And I was interested in political ethics above all at that time. And I took weekly walks with Reinhold Niebuhr, who was kind of the premier political ethicist and actually public intellectual, along with Martin Luther King. And I was involved in the civil rights movement and in King's presence as well. Now, I did my dissertation, however, on Dietrich Bonhoeffer as a resistor to German fascism, both in the church. That was the first resistance movement. He was a part of the so-called confessing church, but then he became a member of the political military conspiracy to overthrow the regime. And because I was doing a dissertation on Bonhoeffer, I read everything I could find on Bonhoeffer and was struck by the fact that there is absolutely no hint of any otherworldliness in Bonhoeffer's theology. And in 1928, so this is well before Hitler, 5 years before Hitler, and he's a vicar in a parish in Barcelona, Spain. And in a lecture on Christian ethics, he says, God is our father, as earth is our mother, and the mother will not lay in the father's arms those who are not true to her. And I thought to myself, whoa, fidelity to God is lived as fidelity to earth. And I didn't really pick up on that for my dissertation. But later, in the same time of reading, I read Bonhoeffer's lectures on creation. And he says we human beings are simply earth. And he goes into the Hebrew where Adam is from Adamah. Adam is from topsoil. And Eve is the bearer of life. So you've got the bearer of life and kind of topsoil guy there from the very beginning. And human beings are created on the same day with other mammals. They don't get a day of their own. They're all from the dust, and they're all infused with the breath of life from God. So I didn't, like I said, I didn't pick up on that theme in Bonifer until later, and I've continued there. But it had its beginnings with the fact that in his theology, you have no break between divinity and being dust people.
I like that. Dust people. That's a good way to put it. Yeah, and it's funny because it is so clear in the Bible and in
Yeah.
so many theologians. It's like, well, yeah, of course. And then yet, so many theologians and so many, of the faithful and just kind of miss that. And our society kind of sweeps people up in different ways of thinking about these things, and somehow fidelity to the earth gets missed so easily.
Yeah.
So yeah, your work and so many people doing eco theology have really helped to kind of turn that around and remind us, like, hold on a second, let's look at our tradition, let's look at the scriptures, and then it's clear, of course, the earth matters, and you can't think about love and justice without thinking about our relationship to the whole created order.
Yeah.
So yeah, really appreciate that. And I'll tell you, the new book, especially from what I've read, it's very poignant, right? The Planet You Inherit, Letters to My Grandchildren When Uncertainty's a Sure Thing. That's, that pulls on the heartstrings. Letters to my grandchildren. And I got to say, the foreword by Terry Tempest Williams, absolutely beautiful, and just amazing endorsements from so many environmental luminaries. So that alone, just reading the forward and the endorsements, are like, okay, what's this about? And then just reading like one of the first letters, like, oh man, this is pretty touching. At a time, I don't know, personally, I struggle with what does scholarly writing mean at a time like this? It's such a difficult time for the whole Earth community. What kind of writing can really do anything meaningful? And then reading this, I was like, this is that kind of writing, where you're really talking about our intergenerational responsibilities, talking about the future, the past, what went wrong. Um, and I also appreciate that a lot of these letters were written kind of during the COVID years.
Mm-hmm.
I think the earliest letter in there was like 2018, and then the
It
book
is.
just
Yeah.
came out, a couple months ago in 2022. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the time frame that you were writing this in.
Yes. Well, first of all, I never thought of it as a book.
Hmm.
It didn't become a book until a friend of mine asked if we always exchange each other's writings with each other in draft form. And I sent him a couple, the first two letters, in fact, and he wrote back and said, could we get together with someone here in Santa Fe I'd like you to meet? It happened to be an acquisitions editor who Wes had passed along the letters to, and she talked with me about it becoming a book. But it was never intended as a book. It was simply letters to my grandkids, because Nyla, my wife, and I are octogenarians, and the boys are only, well, at that time, 3 and 0 when I started. Now they're 7 and 4.5. But we knew that we would not live to see them come of age. They would have a few wispy memories of us, of our time together. And as it turned out, because of COVID, a lot of that was FaceTime together, not the same thing. And so I wrote them as letters so that they had a sense of who we were when we were gone, and they were young men. Now, the book is dedicated to them because, and five other grandkids. They aren't the two to whom the letters are biological grandkids. The five others are grandkids who call us grandma and grandpa. And they are our grandchildren by choice, mostly because one or other of their parents lived with us in New York for a time while going to school. So it wasn't written as a book, and in fact, the book is only half of the flow text. I made a spiral book for all of them, which has, this is the unexpurgated version, but the book is half that long because the acquisitions editor said, our audience is millennials and Generation Z, and they don't read books longer than 200 pages. And you got to have lots of white space. And
Right.
so the book is 191 pages instead of 380 pages. But your question raises the question of how then do we write to this audience, especially at a time when we're so deeply divided and live in kind of parallel universes in this country and in some sense around the world. And I always wanted to write to the boys, write love letters to them. That's our relationship. It's not an academic relationship, professor writing to students.
Right.
It's grandpa writing to the boys. So it needs to have the tone of a deeply personal relationship. It needs to personalize whatever I'm talking about. So even if I am talking, I can't get out of my fact that I've had a career in social ethics. I can't leave that. But when I do talk about that, like in the letters on democracy, for example, endangered democracy and enhanced democracy, I talk about those weekly walks with Reinhold Niebuhr and our conversations, or the time I was in Martin Luther King's presence in New York, and personalize the approach instead of just exegeting Niebuhr and King as such. I ask a lot of questions rather than assume that answers, and I think we need to do that with one another. The book is framed by geological epochs, because Grandma Nyla and Grandpa Larry grew up in one geological epoch, the Holocene. The boys are growing up in the next geological epoch, the Anthropocene. So these are the first letters from one geological epoch, consciously written to people in another geological epoch. So I want to use stories everywhere because I think stories communicate more than concepts and ideas explained as concepts and ideas. In fact, Terry Tempest Williams told me one time, Larry, just write stories and let the stories explain. So I try to do that, but I want to frame it as well by setting the picture as the big picture of the Holocene and the Anthropocene. And it's climate change is going to come into the picture there. The pandemic is going to come into the picture, but it's more sweeping than that. It's a time of human presence and power exercised in such a way that you're changing the planetary systems themselves that the grandkids will have to contend with. And uncertainty is our new home. They are not just the boys are not just in a period of uncertainty and certainty will come along one of these years. No, it's uncertainty for as far as we can see because of the forces that we've set in motion. Well, how do you take on difficult subjects and utterly impossible civilizational transition with young people who will have that as the framework for their whole lives? And in retrospect, I look back at it and I say, by writing love letters, that's how you do it. I didn't think of that at the very, very outset. I mean, that's the kind of letters I wanted to write, but I didn't think about it as the probably the best mode of communication between generations and between people who are on other issues at odds with one another. Within the same family now, especially extended family, you'll have people in ideologically different places. Right. Where they can meet is in their love for one another and as family members. So that's a long answer to your question about how this came about and what I thought I was trying to do. I've stopped writing the letters now because I want to take time to do things like this and blogs for a website. But the website is where I'm encouraging parents and grandparents to draft letters to their kids and grandkids, post them on the website if they're willing to share them, and have that going. Because I come out of one relationship and one career to this situation. They come out of different relationships, different life stories. So I want to take some time now to encourage this kind of intergenerational communication by way of letters that can be shared. But I've stopped writing letters for the moment for that, but I'll start up again because that was the whole idea in the first place. And since the book was published in September, I've had lots of meetings, times with the boys, so there'll be more stories. The book is full of stories. And the one that I'll write first when I start up again will be one on mortality. I try to pick the big topic, and that's a big one.
That's a big one.
And as they're at the age where they're trying to figure out what this is, this business of dying and living. Okay. They're asking questions, and their grandparents, Grandma Nyla and I, and their grandparents in Colombia are at an age where we're thinking about our mortality too in major ways. And Martine, who's the 4.5-year-old, I call him Spud and write to him with that name in the book. But Martine asked his mother a couple of weeks ago, "Mommy, are you going to die?" And Lena, his mom, said, "Yes, but not for a very long time." And Spud said, "Can I die with you?"
Wow.
And she replied, "Oh, how sweet." And then he turned to his dad and he said, "Dad, when you die, can I have your watch?" So, I mean, you have these wonderful exchanges, where they're just getting a glimpse of something that they're going to be dealing with, namely, they're going to have a pet who dies, and they're going to have family members, and grandma and grandpa are going to die. So coming to terms with that, but with these great stories. So when I start again, I'll write one on mortality, and we'll see what else comes with future letters, not for publication, just for handing them to the boys.
Yeah. That's really great. Can I have your watch?
Yeah,
That's
not concerned when Dad was going to die,
yeah.
and whether he might go along with that. No, can I have your watch?
Just want that watch. I'll tell you, that's one of the things I really appreciate about the book is that there's a very serious, gravitas to it. It's very serious topics, and yet there's a very light touch and some really great humor along the way too. I know even when you introduce the Anthropocene, you have this great line where you're like, anthropos, it's the Greek word for human. God only knows why all geologists speak Greek. I'm like, hey, yeah, that's a good point. Why are we so hung up on speaking Greek? So yeah, just little jokes like that. Or I don't know, you mentioned including a graph. You're like, I want to include a graph. It's like it's a love letter, and here I am. It couldn't be more
Both sides
nerdy.
graph, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
can't help it. Got
Well,
to include a graph.
yeah,
So yeah, that mixture of just very deep seriousness with that kind of levity, I think is just really great and so important because the issues of our time are so heavy
yeah.
that a little humor goes a long way to
Okay.
make it
We
palatable.
yeah, we've got to be able to laugh and laugh at ourselves, even at the mess we've made. And so that humor is scattered throughout the book. Part of that is just because the stories of the boys are themselves humorous. I mean, they're fun little things that lead into the topic. I start one of the letters where I'm trying to take on the big subject of what is human consciousness anyway, and are we different than other creatures who are conscious? And I use the episode of Eduardo. He reads everything, and he's reading, and Nyla and I can't understand him. This is on FaceTime, and we find out that he's reading the book backwards and reading the sentences backwards and reading the words backwards, a phrase at a time. You know, well, a 7-year-old, is having fun doing this, uh, and kind of giggling because his parents aren't understanding it either, really. So aims a few giggles in their direction. And but it leads me to ask the question, how can this come about uh, anyway? I mean, what creatures, first of all, read books and then read words backwards and make some sense of it, and then you go into language. Well, it's only backwards if you front of the book is in a book in English. If you're reading Hebrew, you start at the front, the back is the front, and you read from right to left. And those are scratches on the pages that make for language, but it could be up and down too, like Chinese characters, and you could, or Arabic, or you couldn't make any sense of it. So what kind of consciousness gives rise to this? So sometimes little stories, a kid reading backwards, leads into big topics about the nature of human consciousness and what we're capable of. But I want to say one thing about the humor. Um, yeah, that's intentional, and some of it's accidental. It's just funny stories. But the other theme that's in the book that I think is really critical, in addition to levity, is to create a sense of wonder. I just don't think we get through this terrible time. There's going to be massive displacement. It's already going on of people within their own countries and across borders, many of whom will be climate refugees or escaping violence that's been compounded by the fact that you've got climate has made sustainability in their own land impossible anymore. So it's a it's a magnifying factor. But I just don't think we go through this long, hard transition from industrial civilization to ecological civilization, if we get there, without cultivating a sense of wonder and without locating ourselves in a much bigger story than has been the story since the rise of the Industrial Revolution, which was a magnificent achievement, but which brought us an extractive economy and that was fossil fuels from start to finish, that has in turn brought us climate system change, not just climate change, but the whole system by which weather is determined. And if we can't locate ourselves in a larger framework, and I see ourselves as a part of a larger story, even a story that surpasses our little time as human beings in this long stretch of the wonder of God's creation, then I just don't think we have the wherewithal to face this in a way that acts constructively, positively within it. Well, we'll end up just fighting each other and trenching ourselves to get what we think we need and probably do need, but it'll be at the expense of others unless we can figure out that we belong to far more than our 300,000 years as Homo sapiens here. So I try in the book to foster that sense of wonder with the kids too. And on Spud's, or on Martine's second birthday, I asked him, "How old are you as you turn 2?" And then I tell him that when I was his brother's age, I had a neighbor, A.J. Anderson, who remembered at age 5 or 6 when Lincoln was shot. And so I say, "Martine, you know someone, Grandpa, who knew someone who was around when Abraham Lincoln was around. And Lincoln was a teenager when Thomas Jefferson died. Mm-hmm. So you're at 2, you're going back to the beginnings of the country." And then I go into the next letter on the path of evolution, which is in the first letter too, where I say to Eduardo, all of us are stardust, and the calcium in your bones and and the iron in your blood and all of the natural elements of Earth, of which you and I are expressions, we're all vetted by exploding stars. So we're stardust, become Earth dust, and then there's a long evolution until we show up as one expression of Earth dust as human mammals. And so by the time, and then there's this meteor that was found in Australia, which is much older than Earth, but now is a part of the Earth's crust. So I conclude by telling Martine that he's older than Earth by a long shot. And that's quite an accomplishment for a 2-year-old. So this is all just a way of trying to nourish a sense of wonder at life and at being alive, and having some small part in this as one of the sparks of life.
Yeah, it's so, like profoundly philosophical kind of thing to be like, okay, you're 2 years old, but in a way, easily over 4.5 billion. And really, if you think about the whole universe, you're pushing 14 billion years old. Like,
yeah,
what? And it's something that's so simple, and you think, children are such like natural philosophers in a way.
They are.
They're just ready for these kind of like amazing insights and big questions about mortality and time and space. So yeah, it's just such a good exercise to me in thinking of like what this kind of like philosophical and theological reflection is supposed to be. It's like that. It's that kind of wonder, and just go, wow, how old am I?
Yeah.
I think we get so sophisticated with some of our scholarly writings out there, and these letters really kind of strip it down. And you're like, these are the questions, these are the feelings, that's the sense of wonder.
Yeah, and I think one of the big factors in coming to terms that we live in a new geological epoch of our own making, the first ever of our own making, because all human civilizations have been part of the Holocene. None until now has been a part of the Anthropocene. And one of the realities of the Anthropocene, because of what we've set in motion, is that all of the big philosophical and theological questions push to the front. I mean, this is not just late night college dorm exchange of ideas. We have to answer the question, who are we in the larger scheme of things? Or nationally, what kind of people do we take ourselves as Americans to be? I mean, these are pretty fundamental questions. And so I write 3 letters on God in there as an effort to kind of probe rethinking some of these big questions, but now facing the fact that they're really existential questions for us. How we answer them, whether we do it wittingly or unwittingly, how we answer them determines the kind of future we have. So Clive Hamilton was the one that wrote the book that pushed me to this, and he's a public philosopher in Australia and not particularly fond of religious traditions, but he said you can't avoid the theological and philosophical questions that the changes push in our faces.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's never been so urgent to think of some of these basic questions like who are we? What's our purpose? What are we
Yeah,
doing here?
what are we doing here?
Yeah.
What are we doing? What ought we to be doing here? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's very different, yeah, than the late night dorm room conversations of like, "Hey, what's our purpose, man?" Like, well, yeah, that's fun to chat about, but at a certain point, it's like, oh wait, we really need to figure this out and kind of
And the
get on the
one
same page.
the one that I push to the boys, again, just to get them thinking, is Leibniz's question: why is there something rather than nothing? I
That's a
mean,
good one.
that's both a deep theological, philosophical question and the cause for wonder.
That's good. Why is there something rather than nothing? I'm curious. That's another one of those questions. Like philosophers say so many kind of complicated things. It's like, well, if you're talking to children in a love letter, what's the answer to that question? Like, oh, it's gonna
um,
be wondrous.
yeah, well, yeah, it's wonder to me, and I hope it's wonder to them. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I like that a lot. I think it's such an interesting way to approach these kind of questions. I would think that people, in their 30s or 40s, 60s or 70s, like people of all ages, I think would really enjoy this book. I know I've enjoyed what I've read from it because even, if you're not an octogenarian or a toddler, like, yeah, but the way you're speaking about these things just makes the questions feel so alive. And they don't seem like abstract scholarly issues, and it doesn't seem like issues just for, I don't know, environmental activists. It really brings it kind of into just the human realm of like these are important questions. We need to think about them, and you can think about them in a kind of lighthearted, fun way, but it still opens up into this depth of wonder and awe.
Mhm.
I'm
I had
curious.
one review of the book. There aren't many yet because it's just been up. And the reviewer liked the book a lot, but the only thing the reviewer said is sometimes uh, Rasmussen strays from the environmental focus. And I thought to myself, I appreciate the review, but the book is about the Anthropocene, and that's everything. And the thing that we're learning every day, and it came up for us over and again in the pandemic, is that all the dots are connected.
Mm-hmm.
whether you're talking about public health issues or environmental issues or the threat to democracy or the kind of economy we have, these are already dots connected. And you don't stray from the environmental when you talk about, is an extractive economy the one kind of economy that we want? Is it in a capitalist mode with a short time frame for everything and a high level of consumerism? Is that straying from the environmental focus? Hardly.
Yeah.
You know, is public health straying from the environmental focus? No, not at all. Is the fact that we're going to have more pandemics and they're going to come more easily because the world is is shrinking. We're so tied into each other. That's not straying at all. So I've tried in the book to always raise to consciousness that everything is connected, for worse as well as better.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, pandemics are a good example of that. Sometimes our deep interconnectedness causes
Yeah,
lots of problems.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an important point. How funny, yeah, straying from the, like, well, it's so important that we stray from the environment in that narrow sense, precisely because the environment is so connected. Like, no, the only way to understand it is to stray. We're going to need to talk about things like the economy and things like God or the purpose of human life or stardust. So
Yeah.
yeah, talking about Stardust, they're like, oh, you lost the environment there. Now you're talking about the cosmos. Like, well, we wouldn't have an environment here on Earth without the cosmos. It's
Yeah.
connected.
I read the story, the book that everyone loved, Richard Powers, The Overstory, and a person in one of his stories within the big book says, everything in the forest is the forest. And that's pretty much where we are. Everything that is what we name and see and so on is also interconnected with everything else, that you really can't pull one thing out and set it apart without affecting everything else. So everything in the forest is the forest.
Seems like one of the fundamental lessons of ecological thought is that everything's interconnected. It's a
Yeah,
simple point of its interconnectedness. And once you really take that to its ultimate conclusion, you
yeah,
start thinking really big, even about the smallest issues, start to be connected to all of our social systems, politics,
yeah.
evolution, theology, philosophy. So yeah, I really appreciate that. I'm glad that in that sense you strayed from the environment. It makes the book so much more relevant, and yeah, I think that's what Anthropocene thinking has got to be. Yeah, and
And science has been wonderful. Now, part of this is just because I am not a scientist and haven't taken science courses since college and I haven't kept up. But it has been a wonderful education to read about microbes and bacteria in the smallest uh, life systems that are in any spoonful of dirt
yeah,
on the one hand, and realizing that, you know, the number of uniquely human cells in our body is a tiny fraction of who we are. And so I write one letter on the kindness of microbial strangers, that we wouldn't live for a minute without the kindness of all of those microbial beings that are a part of our body, and that our bodies are such wonders in and of themselves. And so you go from the tiniest, from the cell or DNA, you know, written into the life code, written into every cell. You go from that scale to the cosmos as the only explanation for the small scale. So I say to the boys, you should put a note on your backpack going to school that says, as little, so big, and see what conversations you might have with your friends about the relationship of the tiniest to the biggest thing of all, or as big, so little.
Right.
you know, um, but I wouldn't understand a bit of that if it weren't for what science has been bringing to the fore, um, whether it's quantum uh, physics or whether it's molecular biology. I mean, it's just been such a gift to us to understand the miracle of which we're part.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think especially recently, so many like the Overstory, by Richard Powers is a good
Yeah,
example. People start being like, "Oh, it turns out that trees are a lot smarter than
yeah,
we were giving them credit for."
yeah, yeah. They're social creatures, it turns out. They communicate with one another. So if one of them's having a bad day because some invasive species, it sends chemical signals to the neighbors, or it communicates by way of roots. And one of the things I learned about trees was that we don't really plant them the right way when we plant them apart from each other on city streets
Right.
because they're social creatures. They want to be in touch.
Yeah. Yeah. They're like, "Where are all my friends? Like, what am I doing here?"
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I think, Sam, it's just taking us so long to get over the profound Western dualism that came with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, where we had compact um, energy in the form of fossil fuels that we could take anywhere we want and use it to build a habitat of any kind we wanted, because we could separate ourselves from the rest of the environment and build a habitat we thought of our own. Of course, it's dependent on everything else, but that kind of dualism that came after the Industrial Revolution, above all, people before then knew they had to live by the seasons and adjust to that. And farmers have never totally lost that. But people who had all the benefits that the Industrial Revolution brought, that deepened the dualism of human beings from the rest of life, that we consider ourselves pretty much autonomous,
Yeah.
when it's a ridiculous notion. Ask the microbes.
Yeah. Exactly. Ask the microbes who's in charge.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah.
Actually, if you took the life just and kind of piled it up, the bacteria would be overwhelmingly a larger chunk of it than human beings.
Yeah. It's weird to think, like, what,
Yeah,
who am I? What's all this stuff made of here? I'm
yeah,
mostly non-human in a sense.
yeah,
So yeah, it's amazing that people were ever convinced of that dualism. That
yeah.
humans could be separate from nature and in charge of nature.
Yeah, it goes so deep, though. I mean, it does go back to something you mentioned at the very outset. It goes back to the Greeks again. Everything goes back to the Greeks, like in my great Greek wedding. You know,
Right.
everything goes back. The father of the bride is always talking about what the etymology of any word
Yep.
is, of course, from Greek. But it does go back to the Greek, where you did have a separation of matter and spirit. And spirit was its own realm. And when you can divide matter and spirit and see them as separate, you've already set the stage for something that then becomes entrenched after the Industrial Revolution, when we can build our own habitats and think that they're not separate. And one reason I and continuing to be so fond of Dietrich Bonhoeffer also as a theologian for the Anthropocene, as he never makes the separation of matter and spirit.
Hmm. Yeah, and there's so many books and articles and things where people are really trying to criticize that dualism and find a
Yeah,
way through. And I'm not sure if it's occurred to most of us that maybe one of the ways through would be love letters.
yeah,
The way to talk about this, how do we heal this kind of rift? It's not just going to be through scholarly arguments.
yeah,
We're going to need some stories, and we're going to need some love, and that might be our best way through.
yeah, yeah. Um, I mean, there's something profound in saying that love is stronger than death. Um, I mean, it can go deeper and it can go farther than most any of our other energies
Hmm.
can. I think you know more deeply and care more out of a love relationship than any other kind of relationship. So it is a powerful force. We were with friends for Thanksgiving in Denver, and we all sat at the table. It was our first time to be with them for Thanksgiving. We all sat down at the table, and there was a place at the table that was set, but nobody came to it. And they kindly told us, our hosts, that that was for the ancestors,
Hmm.
because the ancestors are still around too. They're around because of a historical relationship, of course, but a love relationship as well. I mean, that is intergenerational, and it can go a long way
Yeah,
back. Yeah.
that's a good one. I'll have to keep that in mind for
Yeah.
the next Thanksgiving. Make sure
Yeah.
to set a place out for the ancestors.
Yeah. How
Yeah,
do we become good ancestors? Is one of my letters.
yeah.
And how do the boys become good ancestors? My time and my wife's time for being good ancestors is about up, but theirs is just beginning. So if you start thinking of yourself as an ancestor for generations to come, that's another good take on, well, how should we go about this then? What is my legacy going to be? Such that it would redound positively for those I love and for those I don't.
Hmm. Right. Yeah, important to think about everybody. Yeah, that's great. I like that all these letters are showing so many different facets of like what it means to be a human living in the Anthropocene. Something like, well, in a sense, we're mostly microbes.
Yeah.
And in another sense, I'm as old as the universe. In another sense, I'm an ancestor, and future generations will be coming after me. So yeah, it really opens up. Who am I? And you get just so many different dimensions, from the big to the small, from the past to the future. So I don't know. I really appreciate that, and would have loved to have letters like that when I was growing up to kind of remind me who I am.
I told you that I wrote the letters because of the difference in our ages, uh, octogenarians and toddlers. Um, but the other reason I did is that I had a wonderful experience of having all four of my grandparents live in the same village where I did. But I never asked them about their lives.
Hmm.
And later, I wished I knew about their lives before I showed up on the scene. I only knew them in their elder years, and it would have been fascinating, I think, to know what their lives had been. Three of them, of the four, were immigrants, uh, and that's another story. Where did they come from? What did they experience? What was important to them? what kind of ancestor did they want to be? So you're right. I mean, this letters, these kinds of letters intergenerationally can bring something to the fore that otherwise doesn't probably doesn't come. We're so intense about living in our own moment for our own lifetime that we don't cross over easily.
Yeah, I think that's such a great lesson for the Anthropocene that while we're all living for the moment and for our own time,
Yeah.
it's time to open up to this larger sense of who we are and what our responsibilities are, where our love goes. So yeah, I'll make sure also when this episode comes out to put the link to the website for people to contribute their own letters. I think that's a
Good.
wonderful idea.
Yeah, I think so. I hope I get a response there.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sure you will. It's just wonderful. It's a wonderful text. And I don't want to keep you longer. I'll go ahead and we'll wrap it up.
Yep.
But I just really encourage everybody to check this book out and write letters. And even if they don't go for the website, write more love letters. This is such a great way to think through these issues
I,
and to
I
connect.
taught a class on the book, only 3 sessions, and I made the assignment for the members of the class to write love letters to their, in some cases, kids, other cases, grandchildren. And not all of them did. They said, I'm not ready yet. But you got me thinking about it. But some of them did, and they shared them in class.
Hmm.
And it really was a very moving time for everybody.
Hmm. That's great. I'm gonna have to include that in my classes in the future. That's a great idea for an assignment.
It's like the other ones where I had the students in the class write their own obituaries. That's a good exercise too.
That's a good one. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, both of those are pretty intense. Yeah,
Yeah,
writing a love
yeah,
letter, writing your own obituary.
yeah.
That's just great. Oh man. Larry, it's been such a treat to talk with you. Thanks so much for making
My
time for
pleasure.
us. Yeah, really, really a
Send me the
pleasure.
link on this and I'll pass it around too.
Yeah, definitely. We'll spread
Yeah.
the word.
Okay.
So yeah, thanks so much, and thanks for everybody for tuning in. We'll be back with some more conversations for you soon. In the meantime, take care and be well.